All right, I think we should make a start. Our last fellow presenting today is Professor Peter Anderson from Griffith University. Now, Peter was meant to join us in person, but Cyclone Alfred didn't cooperate. So unfortunately, Peter wasn't able to make it into Perth. But Peter has very kindly and at very last minute notice put together a recording for us based on his fellowship report. The unfortunate thing is that it's a recording, so we weren't sure that his power would cooperate enough for us to, risk having a live stream. So there won't be Q&A, but what we could do if you have any questions is you could send it either to Peter or to the ACSES mailbox, access@curtin.edu.au, and we are happy to connect you or put your question forward to Peter. Even though Peter is not in the room, let's welcome Peter and his presentation with a round of applause.
Hello everybody, I'm Professor Peter Anderson from Griffith University, First Nations Fellow. I'm here to talk to you today a bit about my project, which is titled Indigenous Success, Creating a Senior Leadership Capability Model. I'm really sorry I can't be over there today with you. I'm sure that there are going to be some great conversations and some excellent learnings from my other fellows. So I hope that you'll be able to get a bit of a sense or flavour of my project through this very short presentation. I probably won't take up 45 minutes of your time, but I hope that you get an understanding or a bit of a view of some of the outcomes that I've come across for this project. So my project is titled Indigenous Success, Creating a Senior Leadership Capability Model Through Capacity Building. Firstly, I'd like to thank my team as well. Dr. Tu Pham, Senior Research Assistant in the Indigenous Research Unit here at Griffith, and our Research Assistant, Dr. Carla Tapia Parada, who helped me along the way through this project. I'm going to talk to you today a bit about the research background and context. I'll talk to you about the methodology, the key findings, and a short discussion and the implications of some of this work going forward, particularly about creating impact in our sector. So this research addresses the need for a senior leadership capability model. I came to this subject, probably about 4 years ago during COVID, where we couldn't really do research, so I conducted a bit of an internal audit at one of my institutions that I was working at. And I really wanted to understand what the training needs were of our senior executive to be able to implement an Indigenous focused agenda that moved a little bit away from traditional cultural awareness type programs. So what we've seen, and this is only also from my own experience, having worked in the sector for many years, is that often Indigenous change projects or processes tend to start from the bottom up, and there are not specifically targeted pieces of learning almost that sit within disciplines or that sit within specific levels within the university. So it's giving a bit more of a nuanced approach to what we would say cultural awareness or unconscious bias training is, to create something that a leader can actually draw parallels to, A, to their own discipline, but B, also to their portfolio. So some of the context around this is that Indigenous people within the higher education sector, we've found, myself included, is that there is a high level of expectations placed upon Indigenous staff, ranging from the physical environment, student services, Indigenous research strategies, engagement strategies, and what we find is that there's not enough Indigenous staff within the sector to actually do this work in a way that creates meaningful change. And there's also a space which I call the leadership gap, often where we don't have enough Indigenous senior leaders that are outside of the roles of DVC Indigenous or PVCI in and across many different portfolios. And often our DVCIs and PVCIs are often responsible for everything Indigenous. Therefore, they're run ragged, but often very thin on the ground. And what we've also found is that there's a need to actually build the capacity of non-Indigenous leaders to be able to do some of this work, because many of our colleagues in the sector want to do this work but are unsure where to actually start. And it's also recognising that the Australian institution is still has its colonial legacy. We can see by the numbers of Indigenous staff. So in 2021, Trudgett and her team counted there are 28 senior Indigenous scholars in 39 public universities. And I think the Department of Education data queue, just off the top of my head, Indigenous academic staff, teaching and research, it was around 739. I don't think it would be over 750, possibly, but I can be corrected on that. But the numbers are still quite small comparatively. Again, and I touched on this, is why this research really matters, is the underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in leadership positions that are outside the traditional leadership trajectories of Indigenous academic staff or Indigenous staff within institutions. Also, a lot of this work carries the brunt of microaggressions and racism in the workplace. We now have psychosocial safety policies in many of our institutions. So how does that then respond to racism? It's often something that our colleagues would recognise when we talk about it, but then they'll say, well, it's not that prevalent. However, many Indigenous people within the workforce have faced racism in the workplace, and universities are not exempt from this. What we've also found is there's a disconnection between strategy and implementation. Many institutions across the country have great strategies. The UA Indigenous strategy is fantastic, but what we're trying to find is how is this actually rolling down and cascading through institutions to actionable and enactable outcomes for Indigenous people. And so particularly in this project, what I wanted to do is really work with non-Indigenous leaders at the portfolio level and start really thinking about how do we share the responsibility, or how can I work with them to enable confidence, to create sustainable change within our institutions that moves beyond a tick and flick cultural awareness type approach, or cultural bias, or all those training modules that we tend to have within the space. So the way that I went about this project was very traditional in terms of the research. I used a mixed method approach using an online survey, using Qualatrix, which had in-depth questions followed by interviews if people so chose to talk to me. I had a really great uptake in the conversations that I had online. There were 41 leaders from across the country, and it was a really great spread. Vice Chancellors, DVCs, PVCs, Deans and Directors. I also had a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders come in. Although it was quite small, the main focus was on non-Indigenous staff. However, I wanted to talk to Indigenous staff to where possible. It wasn't a requirement, but just to sort of think about what is happening in their institution and what they would like to see brought to their institution to build the capacity of their colleagues who are doing some really great work. So here's a bit of a visual of the demographic of the participants. I won't go too much in detail for that for you. You can see there's 84%, largely non-Indigenous. We had 3% Torres Strait Islander, 11% Aboriginal, 2% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Here you can see a spread of the demographics from vice chancellors down to senior managers and directors, which is great. So I've got a really good understanding within the data of what is happening across the country and what the needs are. One of the things that I found really enlightening and really heartening was the openness of participants to actually talk to me about what their needs are, what they actually felt could help them make lasting change in their portfolios. So I also thank my participants in the research as well. So some of the key findings in the Indigenous strategy. So 88% of universities had an identified Indigenous strategy. However, implementation often was limited to individual decisions, involvement. It was tokenistic rather than embedded. As I said, we have many institutions that have strategies. However, the rubber hits the road when it comes down to enactment and embedding, and the lack of collective action, I think, so that everybody within the institution understands and I might use the word KPI, what the Indigenous targets are within their own areas or within their own level, or within what I would say within their sphere of influence. What is it that you may need to do if, for example, you're in enrolments and admissions and an Indigenous applicant comes through? Is it something that you're able to shepherd through, or is it a process where you send to the Indigenous enrolments people, etc.? So there's a whole lot of different ways in which institutions are looking at this. But what we found was that there was an existence of there was a lack of a coherent process that went from, say, the DVCR all the way down, or DVC position. What we also found was that successful strategies for building partnership, many participants really spoke about the absolute need for partnerships and working partnerships with Indigenous staff within their institution, whether it be the DVCI or the PVCI, developing personal relationships and trust with Indigenous communities. And I think this is really changing the conversation from the past, where we've had quite an extractive relationship with Indigenous communities, to one that is based on reciprocity and equality and transparency, I think, and having some protocols of engagement that all staff understand. So some institutions, they may have engagement strategies, but it is often siloed. So what we're hoping to do, what I'm hoping to do in this project, is actually giving a bit of a framework that an institution can confidently say, here's something that we've prepared in conjunction and consultation with our local traditional owners, on how they would like to be engaged with, or how our university can engage in a partnership with Indigenous communities that is open, transparent and equal, and of benefit to both. We also found one of the key findings is a confidence-competence paradox, where there's a high level of confidence or moderate, experience, yet there's a lack of confidence, I think, or competence in actually being able to engage with Indigenous content. And this is largely through building upon what our colleagues already know or have learnt through cultural awareness training and the offerings that we may have already within our institutions. So this is value adding to that and building on what people already know. So here we can see a little bit of a graph around their confidence and competence and the association between leaders' confidence level and their experience. So as you can see, in the very confident column, we have very confident staff, yet they have a moderate level of experience in terms of engaging with Indigenous staff, and so on and so forth as you can go along. I won't go too much into detail here. So this, I think, is one of the crux of sort of the training, is that what we find is that, look, we're doing really well across the sector in terms of cultural awareness training. So 82.9% of participants had actually undergone some form of Indigenous cultural awareness training or cultural safety, unconscious bias training, or cultural competency training. So it is not a foreign concept. So for me, this gives us an understanding and a clear foundation to build on. So we're not starting with a zero sum of knowledge. There is some basic knowledge here that we can actually build upon, which then can be the next level at the portfolio level. Most had a bit of a mixed response to cultural awareness training. There's not a uniformed approach to cultural awareness training across the sector. Most staff actually believed that it was a positive opportunity, although, like a lot of training that is rolled out in institutions, participants did have concerns about the quality and design of training programs. So this is actually, the content is in relation to the individual and their work environment. So for example, as a researcher myself, how is the cultural awareness that I'm engaging in relevant to a research position or a research portfolio? This talks to the quality and design of programs, and that it's developed with the view that it's not a band-aid, versus really a holistic approach that actually takes in an individual institution's internal and external engagement and environment. So it speaks to the individuality of each of our institutions, or the individual identity, I should say. And also speaking to the intersectionality and the diversity of our workforces and the experiences of our workforces, which I think that from the participants on the previous slide, the 82% had undergone cultural awareness training or some form of training. We need to start with, okay, there is some learning there, so how do we build on that? And that this is something that moves beyond tokenism. Many of us, we've all felt when we're doing workplace training that it is a tick and flick, and we'll just go through the motions and we'll come back and do it maybe in another 5 years when it's due for a refresh. I think part of this work is really around how do we change practices, and how do our individual practices and institutional practices align to our institutional and personal values in relation to Indigenous business in this country. And I use business very broadly. It could be, Indigenous research, Indigenous students, Indigenous engagement, Indigenous procurement. That's what I mean when I talk about Indigenous business. What we also found was that, of all the leaders, they were very supportive of their staff undergoing Indigenous cultural awareness or Indigenous specific training. However, the frequency was very varied. So I think one of the takeaways for me in this process is, how do we build this into our systems and offerings that our staff actually understand, or can look forward to, say, doing, a session in January, another session in, mid-year and the end of the year, that it is offered frequently, and or that it's offered online, that students can, staff and students can actually engage in learning at a self-directed pace. And most of the leaders who engaged in this project received support for embedding Indigenous considerations into their day-to-day business, largely from the DVCI group in their individual institutions, and the PVCIs in their individual institutions. However, so there is that support, yet we're seeing that this is the added workloads of the Indigenous senior leadership within our institutions. So that's, I guess, a highlight there of workloads of Indigenous staff within our institutions. Which leads me to the cultural load, which is the overdependence on Indigenous colleagues, which all of the participants highlighted, that they were often mindful of engaging with Indigenous staff because they were actually already run very thin, and they've identified through the surveys that their Indigenous staff at their institutions are, disproportionately responsible for Indigenous strategy, cultural awareness training, community liaison, student support, and institutional representation. So, cultural load is the additional frequent invisible load that is assumed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. However, I'm not quite comfortable with the term cultural load. It's more, I think, a colonial load. It's a load put on by the institution onto Indigenous staff. When I think of culture, or my culture, I don't feel that my culture is an overburden to me. I'm quite proud of my culture, and I don't see my culture as a burden. That's the personal thing though. So I think we need to unpack some of the definitions here going forward, and that's possibly for a project going forward as well. There's also a disconnect we find in the in our institutions around from policy to practice. We've all seen many different reports come out, ranging from Barrant to the Accord. However, if you look within many of these reports, a lot of the recommendations are the same. So what we're finding is that there's a lack of embedding into practice into our institutions. So I think there's a takeaway here of how do we actually create policy-led practices that are implemented throughout our frameworks across universities, building authentic community relationships, that move beyond the transactional engagement relationship. So, for example, moving beyond getting somebody in for NAIDOC Week, or moving beyond getting somebody in for Reconciliation Week. How do we ensure that there are Indigenous voices at all levels of our governance structures, whether or not it be a key point to actually, that points decision makers or a committee to start thinking about, okay, what are the implications for Indigenous peoples, particularly given that there may not be Indigenous representation at that committee level, to get people to start thinking about it. But also it gives a bit of agency to those committees or those colleagues who may not have Indigenous staff to consult with. Part of this work, I think, is creating agency of our colleagues to continue doing the good work that they're doing in their portfolio areas. So, moving beyond cultural awareness training as such, the findings that have come out of the research is that absolutely training should be portfolio specific rather than generic. I would go further to say it builds on the generic, so that could be a prerequisite. And it focuses on the practical implementation rather than just awareness, which is the key thing, implementation to awareness. And it addresses the complexity of institutional change management. We've all had experiences of change management. There's nothing to say that we could actually run, an Indigenous implementation change management strategy through each of our portfolios, to what I would say to how do we create an Indigenous organisational consciousness? How do we create environments that are sustainable, that we keep organisational memory of our Indigenous business, and that there are Indigenous perspectives in the development and delivery of everything that we do, and that it's impactful and accessible. It's synchronous and asynchronous. I find that as a senior leader myself, I'm often time poor, and so I would like possibly to do my training in bite-sized pieces, in short incremental 20-minute blocks maybe, for example, but with deep learning content. So 6 proposed themes in terms of the development of a set of learning could be understanding the challenges of the higher education sector, cultural understanding, building community partnerships, student support, diversity and promotion, and continuous learning. Now, these 6 themes can sit across each portfolio. So, for example, understanding, if it was a research portfolio, understanding the challenges of Indigenous research. What are the cultural understandings that an individual researcher needs to understand to be doing research? Community-based research partnerships, HDR student support, possibly, of Indigenous HDR students. But I also think in student support, it's around about how are we supporting non-Indigenous students, for example, in research, who might be researching in Indigenous contexts. So how are we supporting them to actually do really good research? Diversity promotion, bringing about the diversity of the Indigenous community within Australia, particularly in a research context that moves us beyond a pan-Indigenous model as such, and that there is continuous learning within this process as well. So, the requirements that we found that are needed is that there needs to be a strong institutional commitment demonstrated through resource allocation for this, and clear performance measures for senior leadership, to make some of this learning relevant, or how do we work with senior leadership to actually develop KPIs? The integration of Indigenous voices in strategic decision making, comprehensive support structures for staff at all levels, so that support is actually commensurate with an individual's level. DVCR, the support possibly could be the DVCI, so on and so forth as it comes down. That is a large commitment in terms of resourcing. However, I think it's something that we can do through a coordinated approach in creating sustainable change in this space. Some of the recommendations from my findings is that there should be developed clear, accountable measures for senior leadership in terms of Indigenous engagement, to allocate dedicated resources for Indigenous programs and initiatives, foster genuine partnerships with Indigenous communities based on mutual benefit, and creating portfolio-specific training such as this that moves beyond basic cultural awareness, and to distribute responsibilities more equitably between Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff, and to integrate Indigenous voices in strategic governance and decision making, and to establish support structures for all levels of university leadership. Some of the key takeaways is to look at the strategic implementation gaps where policy does not actually meet practice. This is something, you know, that we find within the sector quite common, particularly with changes of government, etc., and new so-called innovations in this space. However, what we do know in the education space is the gap isn't closing. So how are we actually going to do that? And I think one of the first ports of call is closing the policy and practice gap, and building our leaders' capacity and confidence and agency, drawing on their deep knowledge or their deep institutional knowledge to be able to create some change across their portfolio, and working across an executive so everyone's on the same page. And one of the other areas is, with that sort of work comes the distribution of responsibilities, which takes away the cultural load and cultural burden of Indigenous staff. And it's also around building relationships that are portfolio specific, that actually speak to the needs of the portfolio and or speaks to the needs of the Indigenous community engaging with individual areas of our institutions. This takes a lot of commitment, I'm not going to lie. It requires us to think about institutional change, moving Indigenous business, as I said, which is all-encompassing across our institutions, that moves it out of these siloed areas, taking leadership advice from our DBCIs and PBCIs in terms of how you best can build your confidence as a leader in your individual portfolio. These are just some other things, and I go more into depth in the report. Some of the references. So I already have a publication, so I sort of done it backwards. So the Indigenous Ways of Developing Leadership in Education was the publication I put out prior to looking to develop some learning that goes with this. Thank you. I hope this very brief overview gives you an understanding of the project and how I have developed a way forward in this space. Thank you.